The fear of fire comes from detaching yourself from the landscape. And the fear of fire comes from taking people out of the landscape. You know, I've been to a lot of country that's been like totally incinerated through wildfires and bad fires. And going through Tathra wasn't anything different to many other places I've been to. Not one green leaf left on the trees. No grasses, no sounds of birds. Just a total barren space that once was life. And so going into those places breaks my heart, because we know that shouldn't be happening. And we know that we can prevent it if we look after the land.
Well, today we're out here doing a cultural burn at WILLCOX, not far from Tathra. With a cultural burn, it's a lot cooler than a hazard reduction burn. A hazard reduction burn does more damage to the ground and the land than good, really. But with this cool burn, we're going to see some nice regrowth of little herbs and grasses mainly. We want to get them grasses back here. With this soil, we call it sand-ridge country. When burnt right, you're going to get a lot of bush tucker and medicine plants come back through this sandy soil. If it's too hot, you're going to bake all the seeds and all the nutrients and that's under there in the dirt. I love land management. I love looking after my land. My land is my mother, our mother, and she looks after us, so it's only right we look after her.
That was my first year last year of knowing what cultural burning was, and we met with Uncle Victor STEFFENSEN, and he is really quite a knowledgeable man, and he gave us quite an insight on what cultural burning is. You can see the difference after the fire, just the amount of vegetation that comes back, and then in turn with that vegetation that returns, animals will return. We've seen 2 yellow robins come into the burnt out area and was just picking around in the burnt ash looking for grubs. And that in turn feeds them, and then that in turn helps seed everywhere else. It's very homing knowing that this cultural knowledge isn't going to be forgotten. It's sort of a calming feeling, because it's our cultural obligation to do these sort of things. It has been for thousands of years, and getting us back on land is such a great thing.
I like to know more about my tradition, how our habitats burn and all that. So my pop's one of the traditional owners of this land. Yeah, so I'd like to follow on by his word and all that. Look after the land like he'd like us to. Yeah, feel at home too while I'm here, so yeah.
We're reviving ancient practices, and we really need to. We've been doing what we call conventional hazard reduction burning for well over a century now, and it clearly isn't working. At Tathra, where we just had the recent bushfires back in March, there were areas of bush that had been burnt 4 years ago using conventional, but actually very good practice, conventional hazard reduction burning, and the fuel loads were back and it didn't work. What we're doing here, cool burning, very low flame height, and trying to change the vegetation structure so that we have less fire-loving plants like bracken fern, leading to extreme fuel loads. The main threat after a bushfire to the land is if it was a really hot fire, you're going to get plants back that probably like hot fires. And if you repeat that cycle, you end up with what we've got, this sort of bouncing between having a burnt and then having this fuel load build up, and then a wildfire or a hazard reduction burn goes in. It just clearly isn't a satisfactory solution.
Well, there's a lot more care taken with this than a hazard reduction burn. Staying with the fire, working with the fires, you got to know the land.
We've got some evidence at Tathra that the work we did there last year had an impact, a significant impact in terms of the wildfire effects back in March. So we see, and others see, that if we can do this work on the BEGA Land Council land that forms the interface with townships, you know, we can reduce the risk of a repeat of what happened in Tathra. You know, wildfires, you can view them as a natural phenomenon or you can see them as a man-made phenomenon. I'd suggest the latter. I think it's because of the lack of proper land management with fire that we end up in that situation. I think we can, by using these techniques, we can avoid that in the future.
This is a site that we had engaged with the Land Council to do some trial cultural burning practices just on the edge of Tathra. We look back here and so we don't have as much of the bracken type vegetation. We're getting a consistent sprouting of nice grasses that have come back across the site, and you haven't got as much charring up the trees. But if we span around the site and the further we go down into the areas that we hadn't done any previous burning, we've got charcoal and scorch right to the top of the tree canopy. The wind change on the day probably had an influence on that as well, but because there were lower fuel loads here, it did stop the fire progressing further on into the township. The last time this site was burnt was with a hazard reduction in 2009, and we saw a lot of casuarina regrowth and the forest became really thick, and that's probably the subsequent result of the hazard reduction burn and no follow-up burning. And so that's the sort of thing that we may see improve on this site, that the reintroduction of cultural burning would probably represent more frequent burning. We're getting that fuel reduction work done as well as bringing life back into the land.
By the time the fire got to here, it would have been extremely hot. And so you get a lot of species that coming back that don't belong to this country. The bracken acts as an invasive native and it starts choking out the area. It's bad enough that our people have lost our own identity through stolen generation, through being dispossessed from our land. But not only that, because of mismanagement of country, even now country's losing its own identity through these invasive natives that are taking over and choking out areas where they're not meant to be. Here we have an area where we've put the cool fire in after the wildfire. As you can see, we've got the bracken coming back, and in this area through here, the bracken is a lot thinner than say in areas where we haven't put that cool fire in. And by opening up the ground here, we're getting different species. We've got like a little lamandra here coming back, little native grass, and it's just trying to open that country up so that it gives a chance for these other grasses and other little herbs and shrubs to come through and not get choked out by the bracken.
From our test burnings that we have done in these areas, we're just documenting what has grown back. We throw our little metal circle and then we clear it. Then we count how much regrowth has grown under the bracken. There's only three bracken. And then we've got about 10 little seedlings growing. You know, it's a learning thing for us too, because as, you know, our elders, as they pass on in years to come, we'll have the knowledge of the land and teach our younger generation to find that sense of love of land like we all have. So, yeah.
Cultural burning is not just about Aboriginal people dropping matches into country and burning country. There's cultural protocols about burning country. It's about reading country, looking at country and knowing when to burn. And by burning at the right time, getting back that healthy country will create a safer environment.
The knowledge realm of Indigenous fire management are layers and layers and layers of knowledge, and so many different trees and so many different country types and so many different places and ecosystems that burn all differently in different times of year. And it's very technical, and there's a lot of science. Understanding all your trees and knowing all the different animals and all the breeding and knowing all the different bush foods and bush medicines, and like all of that is part of fire management. What Indigenous fire represents is it's thousands of years of getting to know that landscape, and it means connecting to that landscape. It means looking after that landscape and become part of that country again.